This podcast is part of OctOSR, the October-long celebration of old school games, old school rule sets, and old school styles of play. For OctOSR this year, I'm going to be going over Muster, a Primer of War, Advice for Playing D&D in the Wargaming Way, published by Arkenstone Publishing, written by Eero Tuovinen. It can be found on the Arkenstone Publishing page on DriveThruRPG. The PDF is pay what you want, and I will include a link in the show notes. In picking up with Muster, a Primer for War, Advice for Playing D&D in the Wargaming Way, the next section talks about game texts and game rules. And I've actually had one person reach out to me via Discord to say they've been enjoying it and they've been following along in the book. So from this point on, I'm going to try to reference pages in the text so that if anyone is trying to follow along, they can find what I'm reading from and see it for yourself. So this is page 62. It's entitled Reading Advice. Take any old school D&D rules text as your starting point. It doesn't matter which. The game has an inchoate creative history, and its text tend to step dance around the essential matter of purpose. Fairly early on, in the early 1980s, the texts started encouraging an understanding of the game that is more about the exciting experience of being a fantasy adventurer and less about the wargame. Even that, though, is not an essential obstacle because the actual rules and structure of the game remain for a time. Refer to your rules text in parallel with the present study. You will find that the text describes procedures and game mechanics for creating and leveling fantasy adventures. There's a section of combat rules intended for resolving small skirmish battles. Hopefully, there is a set of dungeoneering rules and the procedures of underground maze exploration. All of this rules matter ultimately exists in service to the higher order idea of adventurous maneuvering against dynamic opposition in a fantastic milieu. The particulars of how the rules do this are fairly clever in places. It is more important that the players confront a puzzle, a challenge, given this fictional situation. This scenario, what would the hero choose? What maneuver would bring you victory? The rules are merely the language. And then moves on the next page to appropriate game texts. Many people will unhesitatingly call what I am teaching here old school D&D. That's fine. I often use the term myself. The reason I'm not putting it front and center is I don't want to appropriate a label that has wider cultural sensibilities. There certainly are players of old school D&D who would disagree with what I'm presenting here. I want to respect that. Old school refers to the wider culture of what D&D was like in the 70s, and while I think it's fair to call Muster a particular take on that, there are other incompatible old school doctrines out there. So I want to take a moment here to skip back to the back part of the book, to the appendix, because there is an appendix here that has various things in the back, including a glossary and some tales, what he calls war stories, giving examples of play that he has had in his own campaign. And he scatters these throughout the book, so there are others, and I'm really skipping over those. I think those are useful, but I'm trying to skip more the idea of the text of what the wargaming way is. So going back to page 213, he has a short history of D&D. The earliest type of D&D was also the first tabletop role-playing game. Wargamers Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson developed a pretty innovative game in the early 70s out of the intellectual flotsam and jetsam of the era. The game was a refereed war game about small unit exploration and commando warfare in fantastic underground mazes. This style of D&D nowadays often being called old school. Old school D&D became a veritable hit among the gaming audience at the time, expanding the reach of the wargaming hobby so far as to break off as an independent hobby of culture and role-playing in a few short years. Important game texts of the era include the foundational 74 edition of D&D, as well as the basic D&D line of products that the publisher TSR put out to serve the market, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was a major publication in the late 70s that for many serves as the capstone of the old school era. Old school game texts continued being published, particularly under the basic D&D label, throughout the 80s and into the early 90s, but it could hardly be called the mainstream of D&D by then. And then there's a section called Then the Game Changed. While being recognizably the dominant strain of D&D over the 70s, in hindsight, old school D&D was remaindered into obscurity relatively quickly in the early 80s as a new style of D&D, arguably a new game altogether, came into vogue with new cadres of hobbyists and publishers. This new style of D&D discarded the wargame framing of the old game and instead emphasized literary, stylized high fantasy plots. The neutral referee figure was replaced by a game master responsible for conducting a fantastic experience of adventure. The change at the time in how D&D was understood was relatively organic, helped along by the obvious freedom for any given group to keep playing whatever style they liked. Nevertheless, we found it useful to since label the distinct new 80s style of D&D. I like calling it the middle school because, like old school, it was not the end of the D&D story. And then he goes on to talk about after TSR went bankrupt and Wizards of the Coast took over, D&D was reinvented again around the millennium with the publication of the third edition of the game. This time of change was more driven by corporate concerns than hobbyist inclinations. The game needed to become easier to sell so as to appeal to a new generation of gamers grown on minis, collectible card games, and video games. Decisive new features were introduced into the game at this time, were a focus on carefully balanced set-piece combat encounters and character optimization. The rules complexity skyrocketed to unprecedented heights. This new style of game is often called, you guessed it, new school, although for most hobbyists it is, of course, simply Dungeons & Dragons. The game texts of the new school D&D are the respective core books of the various game lines. The editions, the 3E, 4E, and 5E, each involve dozens and hundreds of books. Each edition presents a complex, standalone rules chassis for what amounts to a tactical miniature skirmish combat game. Moving outside the text for a moment, you can see some of this movement at the same time in the wargaming hobby. You see a lot of skirmish games like War Machine and Hordes coming out of the hobby this time, and balance was a big deal. Balanced units, balanced factions, so that any group could be laid up against another group in a scenario and have an equal chance of winning. So I think that the fact that this is occurring in both the wargaming hobby and the role-playing game hobby shows that they're still related, if not as interconnected as they were in the 70s when the RPG hobby was first birthed from the wargaming hobby. Getting back to the text, there's also in that section of the appendix a page that has a little chart showing the changes, the different editions of the game through time, and labeling them on the old school, middle school, new school axes. Old school shows Chainmail, the miniatures war game that preceded D&D that Gary Gygax was one of the co-creators of. Then the 1974 version, which is labeled here D&D, which a lot of folks refer to as OD&D. Basic D&D 1977, which a lot of people call Holmes Basic. Advanced D&D, of course. And then Basic 2E, what he calls Basic 2E in 1981 and Basic 3E in 1983, which would be respectively usually referred to as BX and BECME. And then Rules Cyclopedia. And then down in that same section, under the Old School Renaissance, Hackmaster, Castles and Crusades, Osric, Labyrinth Lord, Swords and Wizardry, and Lamentations of the Flame Princess. Under Middle School, he has Dragonlance, 1984, which came out for the first edition of AD&D. AD&D 2E in 1989, and the Player's Option books of 1995. And then finally, New School, D&D 3rd edition, D&D 4th edition, Pathfinder, and D&D 5th edition. Moving away from the text, my own comments. I see now, looking back and looking through 2nd edition, the end of 2nd edition, the parts that some people refer to as 2.5, which include the player's option and DM's option books and all the what they call splat books, so the complete whatever, the complete psionics, the complete fighter, the complete dwarf. I see a lot of the things that are being done in those books are pretty tightly related to what 3E ends up looking like. And no doubt those ideas had a lot of influence. So the line, I think, between the middle school and the new school is, maybe not a straight line. Here's 3E and new school starts, but I think it starts to blend in. And you could probably say the same thing about, especially with him including Dragonlance in 1984, the line between old school and middle school being kind of a continuum. And did it pick up with some of the other hardbacks like Wilderness Survival Guide or Dungeoneer Survival Guide or Oriental Adventures or Unearthed Arcana, what some people call 1.5. So it's a spectrum. It's not a sharp divide. And I think it goes to what he says in going back to page 63, where he says, I don't consider the specific choice of rules text essential to playing the wargaming way. You could even take the most recent edition of D&D 5th at this writing and apply the playstyle to that. It just takes more effort. So the rules are starting place. That last part is my commentary. So getting back to the text on page 63. Ultimately, the choice of rules, is what he's saying here, should only depend on whether the mechanical aesthetics please you and how well the rules chassis applies to your campaign subject matter in a simulative sense. It also helps if the rules text doesn't actively militate against the wargaming way, but up to you how much critical reading and initial revamping you feel like doing. To be clear, whatever rules text you choose, it can only ever be a starting point. Choosing a starting point that seems pleasant to work with, but do not make the system a totem of worship. The wargaming way is to mar it with the reality of rulings that will come, to each campaign their own. So stepping away from the text again to my own comments, I think this does serve as kind of a line that maybe separates the wargaming way from a lot of other OSR thought. Because there is if you ask people what is OSR, and we heard this a lot in the first OctOSR last year, where people were trying to define what they see as OSR. And there was a dividing line between those who see OSR as a play style and those who see OSR as being based on the TSR era rules. And, there's variables even within those two groups, of course, because some people say, AD&D 2nd edition, not really. And others may go so far as to say, not beg me. But the general consensus, there's not a general consensus on what OSR is, but it weighed pretty heavily, at least in the podcasts and blogs that I saw, towards defining it by the rule sets. If it used if it used the rule sets of the TSR era, or used the rule sets based on TSR era, or was compatible with TSR era D&D, then it's OSR. And I think what he's saying here is that the D&D rules all will have some things in common, but they're a starting point, and so the specific texts don't actually matter. What he's trying to get towards in this book is a style of play, and the rules are just the start of getting there. And he has emphasized to this point in this book that it's about the campaign more than the rule set, because once you get started, the rules are going to morph and change to fit what you're trying to simulate, because it's a simulation. He used that term several times, and that sets it apart from going back to what he was talking about, the three different styles, from being, simply a fantasy adventure, or simply or a skirmish level game where the rules are very tight and complex. It's about getting a feel without, again, as you said, falling into, just trying to exist in that world. It's a game, and it's a game, but it's also a simulation. And I'm pretty sure I'm not being clear on that, but I find the idea interesting just because as a war gamer, there's a lot of discussion of their war games, of their simulations. What are they simulating? Are they simulating? Well, does that mean you're trying to be like the real world? Do you need lots of complex rules? This is an argument that has existed in the wargaming hobby, on the board game side particularly, for quite a while. But let's get back to the text. I'm getting well off subject here. Rules are simple and crude. I will address a fairly obvious reaction that people often have when encountering D&D for the first time. This is all the more true for gamers first trained in other games. The first reaction is that when you read a rules text, the rules of the game are both fairly simple and fairly crude compared to other games. Technical conservatism ruled D&D culture over its first 3 decades, which is a bad place to be when you're also developing new things and therefore going through much awkward, crude design work. For example, you're unlikely to find an elaborate skill rule system in a D&D rules text worthy of the name. And if you do, it's going to be quite primitive and crude, and it will still take many pages of dense rules text managing to simultaneously be simple and complicated. And here the author goes into how in Finland, where he's from, that it was not uncommon for gamers to be brought up on post-D&D trad games like RuneQuest, Paranoia, and Cyberpunk 2020, but without the hegemony of the D&D typical of American experience. When that teenager brought up with the post-D&D mature RPG tradition encountered D&D, Mincer Basic, and AD&D 2, and in my case, the game was nigh incomprehensible. And it wasn't just because I lacked the creative context for understanding how a role-playing game could even be played like a war game. No, if anything, I was more confounded with how crude and messy the game was technically. Entirely missing the idea of challenge didn't help, of course, but still, these were not top-shelf game texts by the measure of time. So that's the thing, but with some experience under my belt, I think I can explain why this is the situation. The explanation might be helpful for building some trust. You should try the game on its own merits before condemning it for not fitting into the standards of later role-playing games not built with the wargaming way in mind. So moving on over to page 67, why be simple? D&D rules are essentially simple because they are intended to be used in short, atomistic, formal mechanical chains that constantly dip back into the fictional situation that the players are tracking with their minds, maps, and playing pieces. The rules need to withstand the stresses of allowing the fiction to develop organically. The later tradition of tabletop role-playing has the luxury of discarding this generic applicability requirement in favor of fixed assumptions about stable scenarios. You can afford to build more elaborate if you have stronger perceptions about what the game will be. Basic theatrical set pieces can afford more formal, complex detail than real improvisation. D&D is capable of adjudicating skirmish warfare with major dynamic inputs. A well-developed D&D campaign features authentic operational maneuvers that cascade into lethal high-stakes battles with a wide variety of natures, from sieges to chases, all in real time. You can resolve 20 skirmishes in the time it takes many new games to resolve one, and all without pre-session preparations. Another example is character creation, something that's become the primary activity of extreme complexity in some branches of modern role-playing. The process used in D&D is simpler, but it is intended for an authentic, high-lethality game where you really can lose your character 15 minutes in. How fun would it be to combine a heavy meditative character creation project with that kind of gameplay? Why be crude? But then if the rules are simple by purpose, why are they so crude? I've studied the D&D textual tradition a fair bit, and I'll freely admit that the game texts only really start to come together after the fall of TSR. Up until then, they start amateurishly haphazard, develop into snake oil insanity, and then descend into corporate pettiness. just calling it as I see it here. It's clear that not that the rules have to be crude, even though that's what it might have seemed like in the 1980s. Parallel developments in gaming and wargaming and role-playing haven't had these issues. Peer companies, often working at far smaller scales, did consistently better through most of the era. And most condemningly, the present-day old-school Renaissance game texts are usually fairly legible, about as much as rules written in other traditions. It's just the root tradition of D&D that reads like it was put together in Babylonian exile. So the main reason for this situation goes back to the nature of rules cruft. And he's used that term earlier in the book. I'm going to go back to the glossary and read off to you his definition of rules cruft. Rules cruft is the name I've coined for a specific kind of game rule that refereed wargaming and roleplay produces. The concept is analogous to case law used in common law jurisprudence. Ideally, cruft is created by the process of play and applied as precedent. The difference between rules as in the rules of Monopoly versus rules as in cruft is an evergreen source of issues for games like D&D that utilize cruft in their process. So going back to the bottom of page 68, the main reason for this situation goes back to the nature of rules cruft. The early D&D rules texts are by their nature very raw transcripts of what by and large seems to be an authentic campaign process by the authors. While nothing in particular prevents one from assembling more logical, streamlined, crafted rules to support play, the early basic texts are not that. They are fairly random transcripts, and what's worse, they've been compiled under the misunderstanding that the reading audience is in dire need of having these detailed, minute explications of the table rules of the original campaign. The texts try to transplant the entire campaign from the author's group to yours instead of focusing on how to grow your own. The way rules cruft works, an adept facility is important for its effective use. Whatever rules you use, you should know them by heart and stand behind them as your chosen campaign material. This usability requirement interacts very badly with the textual tradition of writing down hundreds upon hundreds of pages of minutia. It's not that the rules would have been that bad in the actual campaign they derived from, but that campaign had a referee fully conversant with the material who was applying it to a campaign world from which those rules sprang. And it's even possible for a later group to study that rules cruft until it becomes second nature, but you shouldn't have to because that's some low-benefit effort. The general crudity of the early rules text is undeniable for all that there are some pearls of game design insight in there. What salvages the game as a whole is that you have no duty towards that rules cruft. The game is not the cruft, the game is the underlying structure. If the rules seem crude to you, as they do to me, replace them with more elegance. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We should be able to improve on the early attempts at fantasy adventure role-playing rules cruft. It is notable that when the internet came along and TSR-era corporate suppression of scholarly D&D publishing eased up a fair bit, what quickly became evident is that the actual game, as it's practiced by individual masters around the world, was not crude at all. I recommend reading up on the real procedures and mechanics used by any experienced, powerful referee, whether they choose to publish their house rules as a book or not. They are nearly without exception far, far more elegant, efficient, understandable, and campaign relevant than the historical root texts or the corporate meal made of them at TSR over the 80s. It's a completely different world. This might seem obvious to some, but the textual history of D&D has also involved a strong strain of official rules-only culture. So take this as my counterpoint. The official rules are not that great. Don't believe the huckster. Read critically. You can improve on it and build a better campaign. So moving beyond the text one last time to finish up here. I think what we're seeing here is sort of a refutation of a strain of the OSR that is what I refer to as raw OSR, rules as written. And this is a strain that sometimes raises the old books and the old rules to almost a level of Holy Scripture. And that to depart from it is to commit, an unimaginable sin. But what he's saying here, I believe, is that the primary use for the rules is to start as a place to build your own campaign. And as the world that you are putting together and the players are adventuring in, as it develops over the course of those adventures and over the course of time, you're going to develop your own rules and rulings that fit what you are playing, that fit your table, that fit your group, whether it's a small group of adventurers that you see every week, 2 weeks, month, or whether it's a large group that comes and goes of the open table concept, and you can bring in whatever material you'll bring in. If you're pulling from modules, if you're creating on your own, if you're building off of random charts, that is the important part, what you build on those rules. And the rules serve a purpose. They serve as a backbone, a sound foundation, whatever you will, but they are not the be all and end all. And if it doesn't work in your campaign, you don't have to use it just because the founders of the hobby did it that way, or they told you to do it that way in the books that they wrote. So that's my take on that. That this is kind of that the style of play and who you're playing with and the campaign you're playing in is more important than just the specific rules text. Find something that mechanically works for you, something that you know well, so that you can riff off it, rule off it, create off it, and play that way. That's the way I see it. I'd love to hear your opinions, and hope you've enjoyed this another piece of this book, and still more to come. Still a lot more to cover in this book. So thank you for listening, and until next time, play your game.